You're watching Euronews Tonight. I'm Mariam Zaidi, and these are the headlines this hour. Western leaders from the UK and Poland arrive in Kiev to hold talks with President Zelensky in a show of support to Ukraine as tensions over Russia's troop buildup continue. In Moscow, President Putin talks Ukraine tensions, cooperation and energy supplies with Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Amnesty International says Israel is carrying out the crime of apartheid against Palestinians and says it must be held accountable. Israel rejects the accusations, saying they're divorced from reality.
And a nationwide strike marks 1 year since Myanmar's military seized power. We speak to Human Rights Watch.
Good evening. The leaders of Poland and the UK are in Kiev to meet with President Zelensky in a show of Western support to Ukraine as tensions with Russia continue. Volodymyr Zelensky and Boris Johnson will hold talks later, but ahead of the Ukrainian leader welcomed support his country is receiving from the West, including arms shipments from the US and other NATO countries. Britain has pledged over 100 million euros in funding in order to promote energy independence from Moscow. Poland's Prime Minister Morawiecki will meet with the two as part of three-way talks on security. He urged Germany to reconsider its energy dealings with Russia.
Our dear German partners, it is impossible to declare solidarity with Ukraine and at the same time sign Nord Stream 2 certification documents. This does not correlate. By launching Nord Stream 2, Berlin is giving Putin the weapon he will use to blackmail the whole of Europe.
Meanwhile, Russia's President Vladimir Putin is hosting Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Moscow. The talks are primarily covering energy supply, but Orban is looking to secure more natural gas from Russia. But the two leaders have also discussed rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Although coming under fire from MEPs for meeting with Putin, Orban said it was necessary. Well, for more on these talks in both Kiev and Moscow, we'll be speaking to our Russia analyst Galina Polinskaya in a few minutes. But first, let's head over to London and talk to our reporter Tig Enright. Tig, so I'll come to you first. Boris Johnson's meeting with President Zelensky to offer support. But what form is this support going to take?
Hi, Mariam. Well, listen, in the first instance, a face-to-face meeting, it does count for something at a time such as this. We know that the Ukrainian leader is meeting Boris Johnson and the Polish leader and the Dutch leader at a later point this week. Boris Johnson saying as he headed off on this trip that as a friend and a democratic partner, the UK will continue to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty in the face of those who would seek to destroy it. And I think those words certainly among the most assertive that we've heard from European leaders over this past chapter, I suppose, in relations between Russia and the West, certainly more assertive than Germany, even if cynics here at home suggest that Boris Johnson is merely seeking to distract from domestic political troubles that he's having over his leadership. But there's money on the table as well, as you mentioned in your intro. The UK pledging £88 million, is around €100 million to Kiev to promote stable governance and energy independence. There's also talk of economic sanctions too, were there to be a Russian incursion. But of course, the question hanging in the air is what the UK would do to come to Ukraine's actual defence. And Boris Johnson's Foreign Minister Liz Truss has already poured cold water in any talk of actual military intervention. Speaking in the last few days, she said it was very unlikely that British troops would partake in any ground operations if this ordeal, this whole debacle came to that.
And Tag, you talk about rising tensions, but in trying to diffuse tensions, that really continues tomorrow when Johnson is, of course, speaking to Russian President Putin. That call was delayed from Monday. So what is Boris Johnson expected to push for?
Well, I think de-escalation will be on his mind, as it is on the minds of all Western leaders when it comes to this bubbling conflict. The question is, how influential Johnson's voice really is. As you point out, this call was supposed to happen on Monday. It was cancelled from the British side because of those same domestic problems that I've been talking about, the calls for Boris Johnson's resignation, for lockdowns held in Downing Street, or parties held in Downing Street during lockdown. London tried to reschedule it for today, for Tuesday, but that was rebuffed by Moscow, and the call, as we now understand, is going to happen on Wednesday. I think, though, fundamentally Moscow has made clear that it sees Washington as its main negotiating partner in all of this. Now, of course, any sanctions, economic sanctions, which the UK might impose would hit Russia, would hit Russians, I should say. There's an awful lot of Russian money here in London, for example. Although plenty of critics here of the Johnson government have pointed out that yes, you can talk as tough as you want about sanctions, but there is cynicism about how tough they'll actually be when the UK has frequently been accused of sitting on its hands amid accusations that London is a haven for dirty Russian money, for Russian money laundering. And indeed, there are many Russian oligarchs among Boris Johnson's Conservative Party's biggest donors. Mariam?
Indeed they are, Tig. Well, Tig, let's now bring in Galina, our Russia analyst. Galina, good to see you too. So Polish and British Prime Ministers are in Kiev to show support for Ukraine. But President Putin, of course, has a meeting with the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, where he's discussed Ukraine.
Good evening. Well, indeed, they've discussed Ukraine, and at the press conference after the talks, Vladimir Putin, for the first time, actually, has spoken out about what he thinks about the US and NATO written answer to Russia's security demands. This is something the whole world has been waiting for. So he said that Russia is carefully analyzing the written responses of the US and NATO, and underlined that it was already clear that the fundamental Russian concerns were ignored, and those concerns, he spoke about them, it was preventing NATO from going eastwards, from giving guarantees that Ukraine will not be a part of NATO, that NATO will go back to the borders of 1997. And Mr. Putin said that you cannot strengthen a security of one country at the expenses of the others, that it is not only the principle of the open door that should work when we talk about the securities. And he underlined that he discussed with Mr. Orban the situation in Ukraine, and Mr. Orban answered in turn. He said that his mission was actually peacekeeping, and that the European Union, he said, did not have any single leader that would want a conflict. And he proposed to look at the, let's say, Hungarian example. He said that Hungary is a member of NATO and the EU, but it is friends with Russia, and that the example is that in order to be in good relations with Russia, you have to have mutual respect. Those were actually the first words of both leaders at the final press conference after the talks.
OK, so Galina, they talked about mutual respect, but they've also talked energy. Orban, we believe, wants to secure more gas supplies to Hungary. Can you tell us more about that?
Exactly. The talks actually lasted for 5 hours, and we can suggest that energy was one of the main topics on the table, because after the leaders said that they are talking about more gas supplies from Russia to Hungary, we are talking about 1 million cubic meters per year, and those negotiations will continue. And Mr. Orban underlined that it is really, really important for his country. Both leaders also spoke about the future elections, and Mr. Orban underlined that he is intended to win. Mr. Putin said that Russia will negotiate with any leader who wins the elections, but underlined that their relation is very, very important. It's their 13th meeting, and of course for Russia and for Mr. Putin and for Mr. Orban, it was important to underline how good was their relationship. And Mr. Putin was saying in an informal way to Mr. Orban during several times.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there, but Galina and Tig, thank you both for your insights. Thank you so much. Amnesty International says the practices of the Israeli state, its policies and laws amount to apartheid against Palestinians. In a damning new report, Amnesty says Israel maintains an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination for the benefit of Jewish Israelis. Prime Minister Yair Lapid attacked the rights group, saying it's no longer a human rights organisation, but instead it echoes lies shared by terrorist organisations.
We are here today to call on the international community to take resolute action against the crime of humanity being perpetrated in order to maintain the system of apartheid. It is the cruelty of the system, the intricate, evolving administration of control, dispossession and inequality, the incredible, detailed bureaucratization upon which that system is predicated.
Let's now bring in our correspondent, Susanna Murray, who's live for us in Brussels. Susanna, good to see you. So this isn't, of course, the first report to say Israel is carrying out a system of apartheid against Palestinians.
No, the Amnesty International report is one of a growing number of human rights organisations which say that the situation for Palestinians in the Palestinian territories and in Israel has met the legal threshold to be described as an apartheid. And this Amnesty International report is after 4 years of investigations. It's quite a hefty report, and it goes into the areas in which Palestinians are discriminated against, such as the massive seizure of Palestinian land and homes, the demolitions of Palestinians' homes, the forcible transfer of Palestinian populations outside of their land in order to make way for illegal Israeli settlements, the unlawful killing of Palestinian protesters, the unlawful detention of Palestinian children, and other areas where there's documentation of Palestinians where they are deemed to be, quote, the inferior race. So this is quite a comprehensive report from Amnesty International. And I caught up with one of their lawyers, Eve Geddy, today, and I asked her a little bit about what they found.
Israelis can have one type of ID card, which means they can travel anywhere and access all rights. Palestinians can have one of 4. And which type of ID you have decides where you can go and when, what services you can access, and even who you can marry. We've documented cases of Palestinian villages who've been disconnected from the water and electricity supply for years. So families trying to survive on less than 20 litres of water per day, living next door to an Israeli settlement with watered gardens and swimming pools. We spoke to Palestinian families whose children died from preventable diseases or diseases that could have been treated. 2-year-old boy from Gaza who died, Abdul Nasir, in August 2020 while waiting for a permit so he could travel to East Jerusalem for cancer treatment. So in no part of the territory and in no aspect of their lives are Palestinians treated equally to Jewish Israelis.
And so, Shona, Amnesty International also calling for an arms embargo and targeted sanctions on Israeli officials. Is there any international support for this?
Very unlikely, Mariam, that there will be any support for either of those things necessarily. Obviously, if you look at, for example, the situation in the United States where the support for Israel trumps any sort of calls for justice or equality for Palestinians. Here in Brussels, it's nigh on impossible to get unity when it comes to any sort of statement against Israel, even if there are reasonable criticisms about disproportionate use of force or the breach of the Geneva Conventions. Now, the report also calls for the International Criminal Court to consider investigating whether apartheid is there as part of its investigation into the Palestinian territories, and also the use of universal jurisdiction, where some countries can individually decide to prosecute those responsible for the apartheid regime. But I think it'll be some time before we see any of those things materialising. Mariam?
All right, Shona, thank you so much. Right, welcome back to the programme. Boris Johnson continues to face pressure over his position following the publication of a report by Sue Gray into Downing Street parties released on Monday. The Met Police have said today that they will not publicly name those who may face fines for attending those events. The police opened an investigation into 12 parties held under Boris Johnson's watch during the height of the lockdown restrictions. Well, with us now is Conservative MP Sir Roger Gale, who was in Parliament yesterday for that Sue Gray report update. Mr Gale, Sir Gale, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews tonight. Now, it was an update that really spoke volumes. How surprised are you by the alleged breaches of COVID rules at Downing Street?
Well, because the facts have been released for a long time, effectively, Mariam, I'm not really surprised at all. I think the skeleton report, which is all it is at the moment, has already confirmed what we all really knew before, which is that while the public was locked down and having to obey very strict rules, Downing Street was a law to itself and was doing pretty much what it wanted to do.
Are you then also surprised by the number of MPs from within your own ranks who have now spoken out against the Prime Minister following the publication of the Sue Gray report, especially his predecessor?
No, I'm not surprised at all, because I think, like all other MPs, I've been receiving emails, other forms of communication from constituents who are very angry at the way they feel they've been let down by the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And that is why I and a significant number of others, I don't know how many exactly, are calling for a leadership election and a new Prime Minister. The difficulty that we've got at the moment, of course, is that we do face an international crisis. What is happening in Russia and Ukraine is very, very serious indeed, ought to be top of the agenda, ought to be top of the business that the Prime Minister is conducting, and we don't want to impede that. So we're all in a very difficult position. We want to change, but by the same token, we accept that the Prime Minister has a difficult job to do at the moment.
He does indeed. Now, you say that we want to change. Do you also see that there's also a huge damage being done to your own party the longer this scandal goes on?
Yeah, I think there is short-term damage to the Conservative Party, but we are blessed with a lot of talent within the party. If a leadership election takes place, then there are a significant number, probably I should think at least 8, Conservative members of Parliament, any one of whom would be honest and strong and take the country forward. So I'm not concerned about the caliber of whoever might take Mr. Johnson's place. What I'm concerned about is the timing now and the fact that a leadership election does take some time. We don't want to destabilize either our own position in the world or the United Kingdom at a time when all this is going on. There are very serious decisions, particularly as you heard earlier about Russian money in London, that have to be taken and taken fast.
OK, well, Mr Gale, unfortunately we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us on the programme tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mariam.
1 year on from Myanmar's military coup, and protesters across the country have held a silent nationwide strike. Their new demonstration comes amid fresh international concern. Matthew in the Cube has more.
12 months on from that military seizure of power, and this was the scene on the streets of Myanmar. Cities like Yangon were flooded as many businesses closed their doors in a nationwide silent strike. These protesters have long opposed Myanmar's army, which seized power last year and ousted the elected government of leader Aung San Suu Kyi, claiming that their election victory had been marred by fraud. Since then, hundreds of people have been killed amid a struggle for power, in what United Nations experts have characterised as a civil war. Indeed, it was last week that we heard from the military government. They warned people planning on taking part in that strike that they could still face imprisonment or have their property confiscated. And we've also seen fresh concern from the international community about the situation in Myanmar, from the likes of the European Union, the United States and the United Nations. But they themselves have also come under some criticism. Euronews spoke to Human Rights Watch Deputy Director Phil Robertson, and we asked him whether the international response to the military takeover in Myanmar had been effective.
The international reaction has been woefully short of what is needed. I mean, we're talking about over 1,500 people killed, well over 10,000 people detained by this military junta. We have some sanctions from the EU and the US, Canada, but it's not enough. Many other countries like Australia, Japan, South Korea, which are major investors in the economy in Myanmar, have done nothing. This is a tug of war between the people of Myanmar and this military junta.
And Mariam, you have other international campaigners who are calling for a stronger response to help and urge the military to free those who have been detained and help return Myanmar on a path to democracy.
Welcome back to the programme. Now, 6 decades ago, French creator and designer Yves Saint Laurent launched his first fashion show in Paris. Such was the extent of his cultural impact. Saint Laurent was appointed Grand Officer of the Légion d'Honneur by French President Sarkozy in 2002. Now, in a city where it all began, organisers are commemorating the life and work of this unique fashion icon. Neil Riley has more.
In Paris's prestigious museums, a celebration of a unique talent. On the 60th anniversary of Yves Saint Laurent's first fashion show, the Pompidou Centre is giving pride of place once again to the fabled designer. He drew inspiration from the masters of modern painting. Now his work is displayed with theirs.
There are dialogues that are real sources of inspiration for Yves Saint Laurent, such as Braque, Picasso, Matisse, and the Art Deco of the 1930s. And to realize how much he belongs to his time, but also heralds the 21st century and how he's part of our present today.
A man of his time, Saint Laurent, who died in 2008, was inspired by his contemporaries and his predecessors. He saw his oeuvre as meriting exhibition like other art forms.
I think the absolute dream for him was to be exhibited, or for his designs to be in dialogue with those who inspired him or his sources of inspiration. What's very moving with these various institutions, whether it's the Louvre, the Pompidou, the MAM, the Picasso Museum, the Musée d'Orsay, is that each institution, we had something to say.
Au musée d'Orsay, c'est que chaque institution, on avait quelque chose à dire.
At the Louvre, too, Saint Laurent is appearing among national treasures. 6 exhibitions in 6 museums to be discovered in Paris from now.
A great tribute to a great icon of fashion. Well, that's it for the programme. Thank you. Bye-bye.